Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I wanted to talk about an issue that I've seen a lot of storytellers contend with, and that I've seen a lot of newer players, and particularly players who know these games by reputation, but who may not have actually sat down at a table with them, contend with. And it can be a bit of a thorny issue, but I think a little bit of perspective and thinking through the problem can be very interesting, and it can help make everyone's games better and everyone's experience more enjoyable. And for what I'm talking about, I would like to paint a stark difference that a lot of folks have when it comes to this particular point in their gaming career. Because while this may not be universally true, a lot of us start with more traditional fantasy RPGs when it comes to the games that we learn on or what our first experience happens to be. Whether it be a video game version or a tabletop version, it's usually Dungeons & Dragons. It's the dominant game for a reason. But even if it's not D&D specifically, it's often some offshoot of it. So you'll have similar themes, similar structure. The specific names for things may be different. The particular rules about how you build your character may be slightly changed, but it's still a fantasy game. It's usually party-based, and there's often a very combat-heavy focus. And more importantly, for this particular example, it's usually social tertiary, which is to say that unless the person running the game thinks of ways to do it and chooses to reward behavior like negotiating with enemies or forming allies or using privilege in your background in order to gain certain advantages, it's not going to come up. Yeah, you are always going to get more results from casting Fireball or hitting it in the face with a greatsword than you are from any kind of Machiavellian plotting. And that can create a very smash-mouth, action-oriented kind of game, and that can be very fun, it can be very satisfying. But a lot of the time, folks who have that kind of mindset, particularly if that's the sort of games they're used to, if they come to the World of Darkness, they may have a frustration when the style of game that was previously rewarded in another game in another setting does not work in this particular game, in this particular setting. And 9 times out of 10, the way that this is described by people who are frustrated by it or who are reluctant to engage with this kind of game because they think it will become frustrating is they don't want to play a political game. And what that means in this context, so there's no misunderstanding, is they don't want to be involved in a game where backroom negotiations, where exchanges of power, where money changing hands, where all of those things are more important than the ability to stove somebody's face in with a wrench. And that's fair. It's important to know what type of game it is you enjoy and what sort of things you are going to like. However, there is a phrase that I feel is very illustrative and that can be very helpful when it comes to thinking through these issues and getting players to engage with the nuance that can come with a World of Darkness game. And that phrase, for those who haven't heard it, is war is just politics by other means. And it seems very simple, it seems very straightforward of war is typically a last resort when it comes to achieving a political end. Whether it's attempting to take over a country, in either a coup because you wish to achieve power, or imperialism. You desire control over a certain land, a certain population, a certain resource. You are going to take it by force if you can't negotiate it in another way. But when it comes specifically to modern games, particularly World and Chronicles of Darkness games, this phrase can be very useful to keep in mind, because everything that happens in these settings is political. We might not think of it that way, but literally everything that we do has a political aspect, and that political aspect plays into the overarching chessboard of what's going on in your particular corner of the setting. For an example, those who didn't see my previous video about character stereotypes, there's a character I played, Christopher Blood. He was a vampire, and Christopher had a very violent air. He was a character built for violence, or a gun bunny, as he's often called by those who don't particularly care for characters with lots of firearm skills. But his entire purpose is he was a road captain. He ran a motorcycle gang that more or less controlled the ways in and out of Chicago in this particular game, in this particular setting. And while violence was his main tool, it was, well, violence and the threat of violence, he was, at his core, a political character. He would use that to negotiate how much money he got paid, who was in charge of making certain decisions, what seat he got at the table when it came to making decisions, when it came to whether or not the prince would listen to what he had to say. It was all political. That political nature of the character was enforced by a gun rather than a checkbook, but it didn't change the nature of who he was and what he did. And that can be a very useful way of thinking about things for players who think that politics and combat are separate entities that do not engage. In a lot of ways, it's similar to players who think that understanding the mechanics of a game and actually role-playing your character are somehow mutually exclusive. They're not. Often they intersect in interesting ways, and when you sit down and think about them and really put it together, it can make a more interesting experience for everyone. To take more examples of The Godfather is a political film. It's a political setup. It may involve criminals. It may involve, lots of very tense moments where we're waiting for violence to erupt, where we're waiting for reprisals for something someone said, something someone did. But gangster movies at their core are about politics. It's about who controls the money, who controls the territory. If that's not a political thriller, I don't know what is. And when you think about that as a player, when you think about it in regards to your character, if you want to play a character who is, quote, not political, ask how they actually are. Because everyone is connected to someone, everyone has a cause they're fighting for, everyone has beliefs that they hold and that they want to enforce, I suppose, or at the very least they want to stand up for. So whether it's you have a werewolf character, let's say that you're playing a member of Younger Brother, or who is at least allied with that tribe, and they very much want the glory of being a warrior. They want to push back the threats that have encroached on their people, encroached on their territory. What are the political aspects of that character? What shaped them? Do they trust the Get of Fenris, perhaps? Or is it one of those, they have a long history with, those blue eyes out of the north, and we do not trust anything they have to say? Or, take it from another direction. Do you have characters from, say, the Black Furies, who have made attempts to reach out to other tribes, to form coalitions, or do they believe that they should be the ones to make all the decisions? They should be the ones who have the power because they're the only ones they can trust. And if your character is, let's say you think of them as non-political, they're just an enforcer, they're just muscle. Even then, ask, in this game, what is their political aspect? Who have they allied themselves with, and what are the repercussions of those actions? To take a more common pop culture example of, does playing Mario mean you are inherently reinforcing a monarchy by saving a princess? Because we may not think of it that way. It's not the first thing we come into. We don't come to Mario Brothers for a breakdown on the proletariat versus the 1% who controls the Mushroom Kingdom. But that is an aspect of it, and it can lend a new and interesting angle on what you're doing with your character and what you're doing with your plot. So even if it seems like you're playing a game that is much simpler or that doesn't have those aspects to it, everything that exists in the modern day has some type of aspect, and it may not be as simple as a character who is attempting to enforce their will, is attempting to bring about certain political ends. But there are still going to be things they stand for, and there are going to be methods they will or won't use. There is going to be things they're willing to sacrifice, people they're willing to throw under the bus if it gets them what they want. And it's important to think about those aspects and to ask how that plays into the character, even if you're not interested in playing that influence monger, if you don't want to use money instead of a gun to achieve your ends. That's perfectly fine. As long as we all understand that's one way of achieving results in a World of Darkness game or a Chronicles of Darkness game, but it shouldn't be the only way of doing it. At the same time, drive-by shootings, hedge duels, destroying the entire opposition to what your coterie, your pack, your whatever group of supernaturals you are, is going to come with repercussions. And it's unlike just killing a bunch of ogres in Dungeons and Dragons. When you wipe out a street gang, when you push back against the police, when you decide you're going to form a private military company and use that as a cover to take on Pentex, this isn't an action that won't come with repercussions. And oftentimes that can be what players who are more used to violent solutions to problems feel frustrated by, because they often feel like they're being punished for solving problems. And this is something I would tag on for storytellers and for players who may have felt this way and been frustrated in the past. Every solution to a problem is only a solution for today when it comes to the world of darkness. The world is constantly moving, constantly shaping, constantly changing, and it's organic. What you do is just one tick in the Rube Goldberg device. If you wipe out a gang today, you have solved all the problems that gang was causing. You have also created a power vacuum. And if you are not going to come in and fill that vacuum, if you are not going to maintain order, someone else will. Somebody else is going to take that turf. Maybe it'll be a bigger gang who was not sure they wanted to deal with wiping out someone smaller, the problem it would have caused them. Maybe it'll be a smaller gang who just didn't have the resources to take this much turf until you were kind enough to stop by and wipe them out. Maybe it'll be someone else entirely. A real estate developer might decide to gentrify the neighborhood, and that starts pushing people out. Anything could happen, but there is no final solution most of the time when it comes to this setting. And that is also something to keep in mind when it comes to finding solutions to our problems. Because sometimes a bribe in the right hand and making a political roll to find out whose campaign you need to contribute to in order to get them to pass legislation so that a certain thing your group wants happens will solve a plot. Sometimes a plot will be solved by killing someone in a really messy manner, and it sends a message to their group to stay out of your neighborhood. Both are often viable, but both are often not permanent. And that's something to keep in mind. It's just a little thing I think folks should chew on. And let me know in the comments if you folks have any other topics you'd like to see covered, if you have any really good examples of politics by other means when it comes to the world of darkness, or if you had players who were really worried this would become a quote-unquote political game with just people negotiating and using diplomacy all the time. How did you deal with that situation? How did you give your players what they wanted without really changing the fundamental nature of the setting or of the game you were playing? And that's all for this week. Until next time, happy gaming, everyone.